basically, I will give you a little bit of background of my expertise. Since my PhD, I've been working in virtual reality in the context of clinical psychology. And basically, I have focused a lot of my studies on a phenomenon known as embodiment in virtual reality, which in very simple words means that we can have a virtual body when we are in an immersive environment. I will try to explain you during my talk in more detail, let's say what requisites we need for embodiment to be present in virtual reality. But I also want to share with you through some of my studies how the fact of having a virtual body in these immersive environments can also impact different socio-cognitive processes. Of course, you can keep some questions, and I will try to address them at the end of my presentation. So just before starting my talk, I just want to give you some food for thought from a movie, not directly related to my research, but somehow related to what we will be talking about today.
I was born in 2027, after the corn syrup droughts, after the bandwidth rise, after people stopped trying to fix problems and just tried to outlive them. My parents, they didn't make it through those times, so I live here in Columbus, Ohio with my Aunt Alice. In 2045, Columbus is the fastest growing city on Earth. It's where Hallie and Norm started gregarious games. These days, reality is a bummer. Everyone's looking for a way to escape. And that's why Hallie, that's why he was such a hero. He showed us that we could go somewhere without going anywhere at all. You don't need a destination when you're running on an omnidirectional treadmill with quadraphonic pressure-sensitive underlay. James Halliday saw the future, and then he built it. He gave us a place to go, a place called the Oasis. This is the Oasis. It's a place where the limits of reality are your own imagination. You can do anything. Go anywhere. Like the vacation plans. Surf a 50-foot monster wave in Hawaii. You can ski down the pyramids. You can climb Mount Everest with Batman. Check out this place. It's a casino the size of a planet. You can lose your money there. You can get married. You can get divorced. You can go in there. People come to the Oasis for all the things they can do. But they stay because of all the things they can be. Tall, beautiful, scary, a different sex, a different species, live action, cartoon. It's all your call. Yeah, that's me. Well, that's my avatar. At least until I feel like changing. Except for eating, sleeping, and bathroom breaks, whatever people want to do, they do it in the Oasis.
Okay, so the important and related part of my work. So this movie is Ready Player One. I don't know, maybe some of you have read the book, maybe some of you have watched the movie, but I don't know if the future looks like the Oasis, but basically my work focuses a lot on what the character said at the end of the video, that basically you can be whatever you want to be in the Oasis. So you can have an avatar with a different gender, you can have an avatar that is shorter or taller than you, and basically I try to study how this materializes in changes in how we perceive the world, and then I also try to use this type of illusions in the context of psychological interventions. And you will see some of these in one of the examples I will talk about today. So just a brief outline of what I want to explain. First, I will do a very brief overview of what I mean with virtual embodiment. And then I will try to show you how this impacts attitudes, cognition, and behavior through 3 different examples of studies that we have carried out. A first example focused on the use of on racial bias. A second example focus on a body of studies we have done in the context of domestic violence, and a third example focus more on working social skills through these embodiment illusions in virtual reality. And at the end, I will very briefly discuss some clinical and ethical implications. So what do we mean with embodiment in virtual reality, and why this embodiment might be different when we think about other type of technologies? So basically, if we think how we interact with our bodies in other type of technologies, for example, a very traditional one, a computer screen and a mouse device, basically there we have a very clear separation of our body controlling this mouse device to execute actions with a cursor on a screen. But there is a clear separation between the cursor, the screen, and our body. Right, as you are watching this talk right now, you can clearly see your body separated from the screen. The same happens when we sort of embody a character when we play a traditional video game, right? Maybe we are controlling Mario, right? We control the movement of these characters to do different actions in a video game, but there is a very clear separation between this virtual character, Mario, and our body. But with virtual reality, we have now a very different possibility. That is that we can basically see a virtual body that is collocated in relation to our real body. And this sort of blurs the boundary between what is my body and what is the virtual body. As I will explain you now, we start feeling that virtual body is actually our real body. There is, compared to other platforms, there is not a clear difference here of the virtual body and the real body. And of course, these very, let's say, realistic bodily illusions, as I will show you today, might also impact other factors. So focusing on this phenomenon where I explained that in virtual reality, we have a collocated virtual body with our real body, we know from several studies that when this happens, there are 3 factors that will influence that we strongly have this perceptual illusion of owning that virtual body. And what are these 3 factors? One is body ownership, the second one is the sense of agency, and the third is the sense of self-location. And I will now try to explain you each of these factors with some videos and some examples. So focusing on the first factor, body ownership. So the fact that we can experience very strong bodily illusions towards artificial body parts or virtual body parts is not a phenomenon that was first discovered in virtual environments. It's actually something that was discovered in the 90s with a illusion known as the rubber hand illusion. It's quite famous illusion. Maybe you know it from museums or from even reading the paper. It was basically discovered in the 90s. It was published in Nature, and I will show you a very brief video where the illusion is explained. In very simple words, in this illusion, basically participants are asked to place their real hands on top of a desk, but the real hand is hidden from their view, and instead they see a rubber hand that is placed in an anatomically congruent position with respect to their real own hand. Then, as you will see in the video, an experimenter starts tapping the rubber hand and the real hand of the participant at the same time and location. So here you can see how this illusion works. So as you can see, the experimenter is touching both hands at the given location. And after some seconds, participants start reporting that they have this very strong feeling of owning that rubber hand, although they know it's not the real hand. And actually, if the experimenter tries to harm the rubber hand, most people will have this very automatic response of trying to protect their own real hand. And in virtual reality, basically, this works very similarly, but instead of having a rubber hand, we have a virtual hand. So the second factor that impacts the fact that we can experience strong illusions of embodiment or body ownership in virtual reality is driven by the sense of agency. In this sense, with agency, what I refer is the feeling that we are controlling this virtual body. And in this case, the sense of agency, it's not something that we can just experience for a body. It's something that, for example, if some of you have played games in virtual reality or you are familiarized with the virtual reality, sometimes we are represented not by a body, but maybe by controllers. There is also some, there are other games where we are represented, for example, by, I don't know, guns or whatever, but you sort of feel that you are controlling that virtual representation of yourself. And that sort of enhances when we see hands or we see human-like representations, this sense of embodiment or of owning a virtual body. Well, this is basically a brief explanation of how this sense of agency works, right? We have some sensory predictions of how we move our real body in the real world. And we also have these predictions for the virtual body we see in virtual reality. So, you know, we expect that if we see a virtual hand located with our real hand and that we are moving our real hand in a given location and the virtual hand moves accordingly, then because there is a match between our sensory predictions and what happens with that virtual hand, we have this match in the sense of agency. We feel that we are actually controlling that virtual body. And the third factor that studies have found that might influence our experience of embodiment in virtual reality is the perspective. So for this, you can think about traditional video games, right? We sometimes control a character from a first-person perspective, where we see everything from as if we were in the shoes of that character, and sometimes we see things from a third-person perspective, where we can see that our body again is separated from the body of the virtual character. And in virtual reality, we can do the same. And what we know is that it is when we see this body collocated with our real body, when we are in the shoes of this virtual character, that we experience more embodiment than when we see or experience the same from a third-person perspective. So I hope that I have provided you with an idea with what I mean with embodiment in virtual reality. Basically, this video sort of summarizes everything, right? So as you can see in this example, we have a person that when looks down towards her own real body, this body has been replaced by a virtual one. And because in this case, she's using a full body tracking suit, when she moves her own real body, her hands, her legs, etc., that virtual body moves accordingly. And she experiences this body from first-person perspective. And that sort of leads to a very, very strong illusion of that avatar or virtual body. It is something that I think that nowadays most people have experienced some type of virtual reality experience, or maybe some of you have already experienced this type of illusions. But if you haven't, I hope you can do it in the future, because it's something that it's hard to explain, that you have to really experience to understand. But anyway, what we started asking some years ago in the lab where I did my PhD was how the fact of owning these different virtual bodies could impact, right, attitudes, cognitions, and behaviors. And if so, how could we leverage these embodiment illusions for specific psychological interventions? And and the first study we carried out in this sense was focused on racial bias. So what would happen if light-skinned people, Caucasian participants, would embody a dark-skinned body? Would that have some implications, for example, in their implicit racial bias? And this, we studied this back in well, many years ago. It was one of the first studies focused on this phenomena. And basically, well, and you can notice that because at that time we were using like huge head-mounted displays, and the equipment was quite heavy compared to what you have nowadays. It was very expensive. It was very inaccessible nowadays. Fortunately, many researchers can have virtual reality equipment, and it's light enough for to use it and not get neck pain, because this equipment was heavy at the time. But what you can see here in the experiment is the participants basically entered this virtual reality and saw their body replaced by a body of a dark-skinned avatar. In this case, as I said before, all participants were Caucasian, and they could see how in a mirror, right, that they were represented by this avatar, and they could control in real time with their own real movements the movements of this dark-skinned avatar. So before and after going through this virtual reality experience, they had to complete an implicit association test where they saw, I don't know if you're familiarized with this test. If you are not, you can look for it in internet and try it out. So, but in very simple words, in this computer-based, you see faces that might be dark skin or light skin, and then you have different categories on top of the screen that in this case are white or black, and bad or good. And then you start getting these black or white faces. You need to classify it where you see the concept, and then you see positive and negative words, and you need to classify it where you see the concept bad or good. And then these categories start mixing. So you see white coupled with bad and black coupled with good, and every time you see a face that is black, you need to put it in the black category. White, you need to put it in the white category. If you see a positive word, you need to put it in the good category. If you see a negative word, you need to put it in the bad category. And the thing is that from this test, you do some calculations of how fast people associate these concepts based on the times. Based on the times they spend on faces and words. And basically in those people that have a higher implicit racial bias, for example, they might find more difficult to couple positive words with black faces than positive words with white faces. And the opposite might also be true, right? They find easier to couple negative words with black faces, and and more difficult to couple white faces with negative words. Anyway, it's a test that it's not just used for race. There is also adaptations for political views and other type of views. So for sure, if you look in the internet, you will find a lot of information about this implicit association test. But anyway, it was quite surprising what we found at the time with this test, because well, basically what you see here are the results of the implicit association test. Negative values in this figure, meaning implicit racial bias was reduced after the experience. Positive values means that implicit racial bias increased after going through the virtual reality experience. And very surprisingly, what we found at that time in 2013 is that just in the case where people are embodied in a dark-skinned body, there is a reduction of their implicit racial bias. And this doesn't happen when they are embodied in a light skin avatar. We had some control conditions. Sorry, I didn't explain that, but we have some control conditions where people were embodied in a light skin avatar, an alien skin avatar, which was a body that had a very unrealistic color, just to control that it was not due to having a very strangely different skin color. And we had also a control condition based on not controlling the virtual body. So when I move my real body, the virtual body didn't move accordingly. And this is very linked to the sense of agency. So basically, we found that just in the case where people were embodied in a dark skin body, there was this reduction of implicit racial bias. Did not happen when people had a light skin body. Did happen when people were embodied in this alien skin body, strange colored body, and did not happen when people didn't have control over the avatar body. And this was actually replicated at the same time, same year, by another study that did a very similar study, but with the rubber hand illusion that I showed you at the start, but in this case, also including a dark skin hand. So it was not something that we only found at the time, but that it was also replicated by other studies using other type of methodologies. So what's interesting from this, I will not go into this in a lot of detail, but after some years, my colleague Domna Banaku in the University of Barcelona with other colleagues did a further study, not just to understand how these reductions or increases in implicit racial biases when you had a body of a different race work in isolation, but what would happen if, you know, I'm not just embodying a different body in virtual reality, but I'm embodying a different body in virtual reality where certain social interactions happen. Social interactions that might be positive, that might be negative, that might be neutral. So in this study, basically, people also experience the illusion of, Caucasian people also experience the illusion of owning either a dark skin body or owning a light skin body. But from this body, they experienced that some crowd simulation that would interact with them, either having positive interactions. So, for example, the crowd would wave the participant, say hello, smile to the participant. In other conditions, they would act negatively towards the participant. So, for example, you know, avoid walking towards the participant or look at him angry. And then there was a condition that was that the crowd was just neutral. It would just walk by. If you were embodied in either of the avatars, they would just walk by you and just ignore you. And it's interesting because what was found in this study is that also the type of social interactions that you have in these virtual environments based on your body might also modulate might differently modulate how these implicit racial biases is increased or decreased. So, for example, if I have if I'm embodied in a dark skin body, and these virtual crowds interacts with me in a negative way, then my implicit racial bias is not going to decrease. It's going to increase. So the opposite, right? It just decreases when it's a positive interaction, and when it's a positive interaction. So basically, what I like to say with this is that social interactions that happen with these virtual environments might also modulate how we perceive these virtual bodies. So, and this can for sure also have ethical implications for the future, right? It's not just that I put someone in the perspective of a different avatar that has some futures, different race, different gender, and so on. And this will positively impact the attitudes that a person has towards an outgroup, but it's a more complex picture, right? You could also basically do the opposite, because maybe I put someone in a body of a black avatar, but if the social interactions that that person is experiencing in the virtual environment are negative, that might also backfire, right? So I'm going now to the second example I want to talk about today, domestic violence studies. I will give you a little bit of context. So this was basically focus of my PhD. The other studies I talked to you about were led by other researchers, but let's say that this was the main topic of my research during my PhD, and it is also one of currently one of my research topics. So, for example, how can we leverage these embodiment illusions in the context of domestic violence? And what we did here is that we basically used these illusions in intimate partner violence offenders to try to see what would happen if we put these offenders in the perspective of a simulated virtual female victim, and whether this would somehow help therapists in the treatment of domestic violence. Okay, so here is a video. This was done under a bigger European project, but I want to just show you how the tool that we created worked. So basically at the time, of course, now we have different technology, but at the time we just used a head-mounted display. We also tracked the body of the participants so they could control the virtual body. And when participants enter the virtual environment,
parece que tengo cuerpo de chica, tengo este espejo, este marco dorado, la habitación es blanca.
Sorry. And when participants entered the virtual body, they saw that their body was replaced by a virtual female body. So just to give you a little bit of more context, these studies were done in collaboration with the Catalonia department, where basically here in Spain, if you are sentenced for a crime related to domestic violence, you are forced to attend a therapy program. And in this case, we had a sample of offenders that were sentenced because of a crime related to intimate partner violence, and they were the participants of this study. So it was intimate partner violence offenders that were embodied in this female avatar that you saw at the start. We also had a control group of non-offenders. So then we included a very brief exercise just to enhance these body ownership illusions, this embodiment, where they had to touch some virtual balls and see that they could actually control this virtual female body in a very precise way.
Toca las esferas para comenzar.
After some seconds, suddenly a virtual male character entered the scene.
¿De qué coño haces? ¡Que te calles! ¿Por qué te lo pides? ¿Le ves? Me vas a sacar un poco, ¿no? Que tengas militares encima de más.
Well, and as you can see, this virtual male character started to verbally abuse the female character, the offenders embodied in this
character.
Hablar
por el teléfono. ¿Eh? Pues eso se va a acabar. Eso se va a acabar. ¿Ves el teléfono? ¿Lo ves? A tomar por el culo el teléfono.
And as you can see, at the end, he even performed an act of physical violence by throwing the telephone to the floor, and, as you will see now, invades the personal space of the participants embodied in the female character.
Si es que sigo hablando contigo. Tengo mucha paciencia contigo. ¿Por qué? Porque quiero. Porque te quiero.
So we basically developed this scene, and it was included in these rehabilitation programs for intimate partner violent offenders. And just summarizing some of the main findings we had. So apart from very positive feedback from the therapist of how this scene helped them to work in group sessions, right? The concept of what a victim of intimate partner violence might feel in this type of situations. We also gathered some type of more, let's say, objective measure of what was the impact of the experience. And we included some emotion recognition tests that participants performed before and after the virtual reality experience. And in this, basically in this test, participants had to recognize the different facial expressions that might either be of fear, that might either be congruent. So for example, trying to recognize a fearful face that is positioned above a fearful body, or this position above a happy body. But there were also incongruent conditions that make the task a little bit more difficult, where, for example, you had to always recognize the face, but in this case, position in a body that had an incongruent emotion. So, for example, trying to recognize a fearful face position in a body expressing happiness. And this is a computer-based test that you have to do as quick as you can. So it's a quite automatic response. So in brief, the main finding we had from this emotion recognition test was that, so I think I said this before, but we had two groups that went through this experience. So the group of intimate partner violent offenders that were, in these therapy sessions I told you about, but we also had a control group of non-offenders without a history of intimate partner violence. And it was interesting because through this test, what we saw is that just in the case of the offenders, there was an increase in their sensitivity to the in female faces after the virtual reality experience. And this did not happen in the control group of non-offenders, and it did not happen for other type of emotions such as anger, and it did not happen, for example, for fearful male faces. So there seemed to be something very specific linked to fear in female faces after these offenders were actually embodied in a female avatar that experienced this abuse situation. And this has been a factor. So a factor not being able to recognize negative emotions in the victims is a factor that has been linked to intimate partner violence occurring. So then we carried out a further study in collaboration with Maastricht University, with Professor Beatriz de Gelder, where we were interested in understanding a little bit more what could be the neural underpinnings of this enhanced emotion recognition we saw for fearful female faces. And I will not explain this also in a lot of detail, but it was interesting that in this case, we saw that it seems to be related to changes in the default mode network response of the brain when trying to figure out what is the emotions of faces where you cannot clearly see the emotions. In maybe I don't have slides to show you, but in this case we used morphed emotions where it was a bit ambiguous to see what was the emotion displayed by the face, and we saw that actually when you had stimuli that was ambiguous, so for example a morph between happy faces, and participants could not really discriminate what was the emotion of the face. After going through the virtual reality experience, there was this enhancement in default mode network activity in the brain. So these changes seem to be linked to this mechanism of the brain, and not per se to just processing visual features of the faces. A third study related to all this domestic violence use of embodiment is one where we did a further study. So based on the therapist feedback, so many therapists told us before designing these scenes that offenders maybe would recognized that they had committed violence towards their partner, but several of them would deny that this somehow could impact their children, right? They would say that their children didn't saw the violence, or that they were not impacted they were not impacted by what happened at their homes and so on. So we decided to build a further scene where the offenders could basically witness, right, this violence of the male character towards the female virtual character, but from a child perspective. And in this case, we did not, compared to the example of to the first study I showed you where offenders were in the female body, we did not see an enhancement of fear recognition, but we saw an enhancement of anger recognition. So offenders were more able to detect angry expressions after being in this child perspective during a simulated scene of domestic violence. And in this case, we also took physiological measures, and it was also interesting. So here we took heart rate deceleration. So in this physiological measure, the lower the values you see here, it means that it resulted more stressful. And it's interesting that in the red, the case of the offenders, you can see that the responses when in the scene when the offender threw the telephone to the floor were, let's say, more pronounced compared to, for example, when the offender approached the participant. Somehow trying to say that, for example, an offender would find more stressful, an actual act of physical violence, throwing a telephone to the floor, than just approaching someone very closely, which actually can also be very threatening, right, in real life. And the third example I want to talk about today is one focused more on trying to work social skills, soft skills in virtual reality, exploiting embodiment illusions. And I want to show you a study we did in collaboration actually with the Polytechnic of Torino in Italy. So here, basically, we asked ourselves, what would happen if you are training for a job interview and you have the possibility not just to be in the perspective of the interviewee, but you can also re-experience the responses you gave from the interviewer perspective, or even from a third-person perspective view, where you are not the interviewer or the interviewee, but you can see the whole scene in an immersive way from a third-person perspective. I don't have a video of this. Let me check, because I think I have a video to show you this experiment. I hope I have a video. So here, can you see my screen? Can you see the video?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So here is a video of the study we performed. I don't know why it doesn't have sound. Okay, yeah.
Che tipo di ambiente di lavoro preferisci?
Ma preferisco sicuramente un ambiente di lavoro che mi spinga a migliorarmi ogni giorno sempre di più.
Quando devi gestire vari progetti, come ti organizzi?
Quando devo gestire diversi progetti, valuto sicuramente la priorità dei singoli progetti.
So basically, this scene, when I'm answering as an interviewer, is recorded.
Quando devi gestire vari progetti, come ti organizzi?
Quando
And
devo
then the person
gestire diversi
can
progetti,
re-experience
valuto
the response from a third
sicuramente
person
la
point of
priorità
view.
dei singoli progetti.
Preferisci lavorare in gruppo o per conto tuo? Perché?
Ma preferisco decisamente lavorare in gruppo rispetto a lavorare singolarmente.
Preferisci lavorare
But
in
in
gruppo
another
o per conto
condition, the
tuo?
person can
Perché?
re-experience the response
Ma
he or
preferisco
she provided,
decisamente
but in
lavorare
this
in
case from the
gruppo
interviewer
rispetto
perspective.
a lavorare singolarmente, perché credo che la condivisione di idee e opinioni sia il fulcro per
So
creare un
basically, he
qualcosa
can see
di buono.
himself from the outside answering the job interview. And we were interested in this particular study, we were interested in checking whether there was something about being embodied in the interviewer compared to, for example, seeing it from a disembodied perspective, right? From this third person point of view and just having an overall view of the whole virtual scene. And it was interesting because what we found is that actually the condition that participants found more useful to self-assess their performance, their verbal and non-verbal performance in this job interview, was when they were positioned in the body of the recruiter. But actually, they also found that it was useful to be in this disembodied perspective, this third-person perspective point of view. But our results here preliminary seem to indicate that it was more beneficial to be in the recruiter perspective. And then I just want to mention this study related to embodiment and seeing yourself from this let's say outer perspective. Maybe you can check out this study. So this is done also in the lab where I did my PhD, led by Mel Slater. And basically, they have created this paradigm where you can provide yourself self-counseling in virtual reality. So I will try to explain it in simple words. So, for example, that you are explaining a personal problem to a virtual version of Freud, okay? You explain this problem, and then you have the opportunity to swap perspective, embody Freud, and provide a solution to the problem you just explained, but from this Freud perspective. And basically, they have also found quite positive results with these methodologies, and that people come out with very creative solutions to their personal problems when they have this opportunity of embodying the avatar of Freud compared to control conditions where they are embodied in their self avatar or they don't have a body. So just some conclusions from the studies I have showed today. So we do know from several studies, not just the studies I have talked about today, that embodiment in a different virtual body can make us feel as if we were in someone else's point of view. And I say as if because I don't think that it's that we feel the other person. Second is that changing the visual appearance of an embodied virtual body can impact sociocognitive processing. As I showed you today, it can impact the recognition of emotion. It can impact implicit racial biases, and it can impact behaviors and so on from other studies that we have evidence. Also, it's interesting, this paradigm of real-time virtual body swapping, right? The fact that in the same scene, I can embody my self-avatar, but then I can embody the avatar of other people, even see my avatar from the outside. And I think that that's quite interesting and has potential in the context of clinical psychology for self-distancing and self-assessment. Since I'm come from the field of clinical psychology, I also think it's important to say that I do not see the use of virtual reality within the context of clinical psychology as a standalone treatment, as something that can be applied in isolation. But on the opposite, I see it more as a tool that can complement broader psychological interventions. I also consider that the evidence we have so far is from studies that have been performed with relatively small sample sizes, that we actually need to run more studies, randomized controlled trial studies, long-term follow-ups are needed, so we can extract, let's say, so we can better understand what are the implications of using this tool in certain psychological conditions. And also, I consider that ethical aspects should be since I showed you with the example of racial bias and social context, embodiment can also lead to undesired effects, and that's why I think we should be careful when these type of tools are used in not professional context, and that they should be well thought how we design them and with what purpose, and that we just not administer in isolation, right? Thinking about for example, the application we created for domestic violence, I think it does make sense in the context of a psychological intervention where you discuss the group, a psychologist and everything, but imagine that you just applied this in isolation and so on. I think that the effects that we observe might be quite different. So I just want to thank and acknowledge a lot of people and universities and laboratories that have collaborated in the studies that I have showed you today. And thank you very much.